we followed the food as it gets digested into the digestive system in our previous unit. Recall that in the duodenum, we have the biomolecules that we get from the food that we eat. And one of those biomolecules is glucose, C6H12O6. Glucose is the main source of energy for the cells, and this happens in cellular respiration. The other biomolecules, of course, are also needed for the maintenance of the cell. We have the amino acid that we get from protein, and we have the glycerol and triglycerides from the digestion of lipids. And of course, those are made possible to be used by the cell with the help of vitamins and minerals. In cellular respiration, we get the glucose from the digestion in the digestive system. But what about the oxygen? Now we have to bring in the molecules of oxygen through a different system. And the organ system that we're going to look at next is the respiratory system. So this is the respiratory system, and it begins in the mouth and the nose also. And we bring in the oxygen that way, and it goes down the trachea and into the lobes of the lungs. So once you have the oxygen molecules through breathing, you then use the oxygen into the cells with glucose in the process that we know of as cellular respiration. Recall that in photosynthesis is the exact reverse of cellular respiration. So this happens in the cells of animals, and photosynthesis happens in the cells of plants with chloroplast. So this is the anatomy of the respiratory system that we're going to be looking at. Did you know that you can go for about a month without food, about a week without water? But how long do you think you can go without oxygen entering our lungs? Minutes. We're looking at about 3 to 5 minutes. And without this vital molecule, diatomic molecule of oxygen, you will not be able to break down glucose in cellular respiration. So therefore, your cells will not have energy that it can use to function. So this is a very important component of cellular respiration. So we're also going to look at the biochemistry of cellular respiration and the importance of respiration to homeostasis in your body. So let's take a look at the new book. In lesson 1 of our new unit, we talk about respiration. As we studied in the last unit, digestion is a process by which food is broken down into biomolecules so we can use them for energy and build and nourish cells. We need them for not just for producing energy, but for making more cells and to maintain the cells for homeostasis. So we need a continuous supply of oxygen for cellular respiration. So we need the oxygen in and the CO2 out. So these are the processes that we accomplish in the process of respiration. The oxygen that we need, we get it from the Earth's atmosphere, which is only 21% oxygen. So if you take a look at the atmosphere that we live in, we are breathing in mostly diatomic nitrogen. So that's about 78% of the air in our atmosphere. The oxygen is about 21%. In the city, we get a little bit less than that, and depending on how polluted the city air is. And you have your trace molecules, so whatever is left. So about 1% trace molecules, and those trace molecules could be carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, and other trace animals depending on where we live. So why do we not need 100% oxygen? Well, oxygen if you recall from the chemistry and periodic table, oxygen is the most combustible of all the elements. And if you imagine, just imagine if the air that we breathe in is 100% oxygen, and everything that we have around us is surrounded by O2. All you need is really just walk, make friction, make contact with any surroundings, snap your finger, and you will combust, basically burst into flames. So you the cells require about 21% oxygen. So this is perfect for us. Let's talk about respiration and gas exchange. So when you hear the word respiration, you're probably thinking of breathing. Well, breathing is just part of the respiratory process in humans. So breathing is really defined as bringing in the oxygen from the atmosphere and bringing out the CO2 back into the atmosphere from our body. CO2 is toxic to our cells, and we need the oxygen to survive. Respiration is defined as the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between an organism and the external environment. So the lungs brings air into the body. The oxygen in the air travels from the lungs through the bloodstream to the cells in all parts of the body. So if you were to trace the path of oxygen in the atmosphere enters the lungs. We'll take a look at the detailed anatomy of the respiratory system in a bit here, but we'll just focus on the lungs processing the oxygen, and they are going to be diffusing into the surrounding blood stream, and then will be delivered into the cell. And of course, this blood that contains oxygen will need to be circulated, and that is another system that we will discuss in our next unit. The cells use the oxygen for cellular respiration and give off the CO2 as a waste gas. Again, it will be the reverse process. So the cell will then carry the oxygen, which is carried by the blood, into the lungs. It will diffuse into the lungs and then out into the external environment, the atmosphere. The lungs accomplish this vital process called gas exchange using an automatic and quickly adjusting control system. And this is, of course, controlled by the brain. You could think of it as a negative feedback mechanism. So in the course of a single day, an amazing 8,000 to 9,000 liters of breathed-in air meet 8,000 to 10,000 liters of blood pumped in by the heart through the pulmonary arteries. So we're going to be looking at a circulatory system in our next unit, but we just need to know that the air is carried by the blood, and it needs to be circulated to all the cells in the body. The lungs relieve the blood of its burden of waste and return a refreshed, oxygen-rich stream of blood to the heart through the pulmonary vein. So again, oxygen into the cell. So here's the cell. The cell takes in oxygen, and the product of cellular respiration is CO2, and it needs to be taken out of the cell and into the external environment. And we accomplish this through breathing. It involves both inhalation and exhalation. So breathing is a mechanical process of bringing in the air, the oxygen from the external environment into the lungs, not the cells yet, but into the lungs, and then into the cell. That would be the respiration part, the gas, cellular respiration, and then from the cell into the lungs, through the bloodstream, and then out back into the atmosphere through a process called exhalation. And this gas exchange, the process of exchanging the oxygen from the air into the body and CO2 from the cell back into the body, is basically a simple process called diffusion. And we learned diffusion in our first unit. And basically diffusion, I'm going to draw a simple diagram here. So this is your lungs. Your lungs, basically, if the oxygen is low, let's say the oxygen is low inside your lungs and the air around you has 21% oxygen, recall that diffusion is a process of movement of particles from high to low. So this will be the inhalation. So you're breathing in. So you inhale when the concentration of oxygen in the lungs becomes lower than the outside environment. You inhale in a process called inhalation. When when in another situation now is when the lungs have high CO2 concentration and there's low CO2. We're talking about carbon dioxide now. Again, it is a process of diffusion that goes from high to low. And so this goes in, oxygen in a process of breathing in or inhalation. And this is now your CO2 that must be taken out from the lungs and into the external environment in a process called exhalation. So you exhale. And this is just accomplished through your system by negative feedback mechanism. So single cell organisms can exchange gases directly across their cell membrane. But of course, the more complex, larger organisms like us, the eukaryotes, the multicellular organisms, will need to have specialized organs to accomplish this gas exchange. And this is where the respiratory system comes in. And the respiratory system is a wonderful network of organs. Let's take a look at this again, this picture that we have. The respiratory system, as you notice here, very efficient machine that brings in the oxygen, processes it in the cell and takes out the CO2. So it's an amazing organ, just like all the other organs in our body. So there are 4 conditions necessary for gas exchange across a membrane or a cell membrane. So these are a concentration gradient. And again, we talk about the movement of, through diffusion from high to low. So for example, again, if you have low oxygen, there will be an inhalation of oxygen. And when CO2, of course, that cells will bring in the oxygen and then take out the CO2. And in a process, when you have high CO2 in a process called exhalation. So it depends on the concentration of the gases involved in the lungs. So these are controlled by the concentration of oxygen and CO2 in the lungs and the external environment. And the condition of the lungs must have a large surface area. If you take a look at these lungs here, the lobes of the lungs, just like if you recall the small intestine and the large intestine, well, even the stomach, they would have the foldings on the inside, and the membranes have a large surface area because of the internal foldings. And that is similar to the structure of the lungs. So the lungs really having a large surface area means the cells are going to be efficient in absorbing the gases. And it has to be thin so that the oxygen can diffuse effectively and carbon dioxide can diffuse back into the blood, back to the lungs, and into the external environment through exhalation. And of course, you have to make it, you have to keep it moist so that the large, thin surface area can effectively diffuse the gases. Let's take a look at the 3 stages of respiration. 3 stages in this particular order. The external respiration happens first. So basically, this is the exchange of gases across a respiratory surface between the air sacs are called alveoli in the lungs and the blood. So this is the lungs. Again, we'll just simplify it for now. So the lungs will have the oxygen, and the exchange of gases between the lungs and the blood, and this can occur because of the large surface area of the lungs and the thin and moist surface. So the oxygen can diffuse from the lungs into the bloodstream and eventually into the cell. So the second stage is called internal respiration, is the exchange of gas between the blood and the individual cells in the tissue. So now we're looking at the exchange of, here's a cell. And so the blood is going to deliver that oxygen. So the blood carries the oxygen, and it's now going to diffuse into the cell so that the cell can use that oxygen for the third stage of respiration, which is now the ultimate exchange of gases, the cellular respiration that involves the use of oxygen. Now, recall in the digestive system, we have the biomolecule from the breakdown of carbohydrates, C6H12O6, the monomer glucose. This glucose is the main source of energy for the cell. All cells rely on glucose for energy, but this energy can only be broken down with oxygen. So this oxygen is what we are bringing in from the outside. Of course, the lungs will have to get the oxygen from the outside air before it can bring it into the bloodstream. And the bloodstream carrying the oxygen, the blood will then bring it to the cell, and this is actually what is happening within the cell itself. So the cellular respiration that our cells rely on, this is what we are doing in cellular respiration. So bringing in the oxygen, and let me just finish this, the product of cellular respiration, 6 molecules of water and 6 molecules of carbon dioxide. So we're looking at 2 systems here at work. We're looking at the glucose being processed by the digestive system and the oxygen being processed by the respiratory system. Of course, these are only possible because of the other organs in your body that need to work together. So in terms of the homeostasis in our body, every single organ system play a role in maintaining homeostasis and therefore life in all living things. So carbohydrates, usually in the form of glucose, are the most usable source of energy. And of course, the other biomolecules are needed as well so that cells can maintain their functioning capabilities and make more cells and repair damaged cells. So those are possible because of the amino acids and the triglycerides and the glycerol from lipids and proteins. We've already talked about the chemical equation for cellular respiration. What are the other functions of the respiratory system? So lungs are internal organs. However, they are constantly exposed to our external environment. So just like the digestive system, that actually basically if you enter the digestive system, it's just in and out. It's a series of tubes that directly lead into the outside of your body. The lungs are the same thing. So even though they are internal organs, they are directly connected to the outside environment. And again, this is the reason why the lungs can easily get infected, because of the tubes that lead straight through our nasal passages, the nose and the mouth, our eyes, our ears. These are all connected, as you already know. So if you take a look, you won't be able to see this clearly from this model, but your ears and your eyes and your nose, they are basically connected in the nasopharyngeal area here. So if you go deep here, I just got a if you get a COVID test, for example, you can get you'll be doing a swab here that goes deep into the nasopharynx. So they're actually looking for the presence of the coronavirus in the nasopharyngeal area, which can actually lead into the, if you go deeper, it can get into the opening that can access the ears, the eyes, the throat, and your mouth as well. And you ever wonder why when you have a cold, your mucus lining is thickened, it's more than usual, and your eyes also get watery, and sometimes it's harder to hear when you have a cold, and of course your nose is congested, and your passages in your throat is also congested and makes it harder to breathe. So the lungs directly have access to the outside environment. So with each breath, a host of foreign substances can enter our bodies. Things like pollen, dust, viruses, bacteria, animal dander, tobacco smoke, and other chemicals in our atmosphere by smokestacks, automobile tailpipes, and whatever in the air. And so in addition to gas exchange, the lungs and other parts of the respiratory system have important functions. So the functions of the respiratory system, in order to protect this vital organ, because it has external access to the atmosphere, it must have the ability to warm or cool the air to proper body temperature. And you know this already, that your core internal temperature is 37 degrees Celsius. So it tries to warm the air. Right now it's almost winter. And so when you breathe in the cold air from the outside, your respiratory system has the ability to warm it close to 37 degrees Celsius. And in the summertime when it's really hot, your respiratory system can cool it down so then it's not overheating. You also need to make sure that it's moisturized, and your respiratory system does that by keeping the tubes, the trachea, the bronchus, and the bronchioles in your lungs to the proper humidity so that the oxygen can be delivered properly, and also to prevent irritation to your respiratory lining and prevent infection. It also has a defense mechanism where it protects the body from these foreign substances by coughing and sneezing. So these are actually defense mechanism. All right, so what do we have in our respiratory system that allow the lungs to, and the trachea and all the tubes that lead to the lungs to protect itself? Well, inside the air passages, when we talk about the anatomy, you will know that the trachea is the windpipe. So the windpipe is the, it's side by side. You could think of it as if this is the esophagus, this is the windpipe or the trachea. They are side by side, and it is right here. It's controlled by the epiglottis. So the trachea has a lid, the epiglottis, so that when you're swallowing your food through here, the esophagus, the food and the water does not enter the trachea, because the trachea lead into the lungs, and you don't want water in your lungs. It is also lined with cilia, and cilia are microscopic hairs. So you could imagine that the lining of this trachea has these tiny little microscopic hair that sway back and forth as you breathe in and out. So as you bring in the air and exhale the air out, they move like waves of hair, microscopic hair. And this is important because the particles then can be trapped within the cilia, these microscopic hair. So the bad things that you breathe in, the dust, bacteria, the viruses, that includes the coronaviruses, they can get trapped by the cilia. And when the cilia detects that there is something foreign that is entering your trachea and into your lungs, your brain will make you cough or sneeze to get these particles out. Phlegm or mucus is another defense mechanism that we have in our respiratory system. The phlegm here that is lined with, it's similar to the mucus lining in the digestive system, the stomach, to protect the stomach from the hydrochloric acid. Well, the mucus lining basically will collect the dirt and the germs before they enter the lungs, and then cough it out. So that is why when you have a cold, your phlegm actually increases. Your body makes more phlegm or mucus, and basically it's trying to trap those particles that shouldn't be in your lungs. The effects of that, though, is a symptom of you being sick, because now that you have a lot of mucus and phlegm, you will be congested. So you're coughing, you're sneezing, your eyes are watering, your sinuses are plugged, and you can barely smell, you can barely hear. Your body is trying to produce more phlegm to trap those particles to get it out of your system and protect the inner linings. However, because your body is doing that, that can also make you sick. The macrophages, macro meaning they are larger than microscopic particles, these are scavenger cells within the lungs that literally eat up the dirt and the germs invading the lungs. So that is part of your immunity system, your immune system as well. And these things are the defense mechanism that protect our respiratory system from the foreign particles that try to invade our body or just get in there as we breathe in the air around us. Okay, that brings us to the end of lesson 1, and I posted an assignment in classwork that has these questions. So go to classwork and answer these questions and submit it by the due date.